So when you're dealing with another mind, it's never a 0 and 1. So we need to approach it from that perspective. And so we need to have empathy. We need to have compassion because I don't understand exactly how brokenness is expressed in your life like it's expressed in my life. And I can understand. I mean, I have great sympathy for men who feel themselves in that level of despair to where they're
for sure.
doing things to take their own lives. And I think we have to approach it from that perspective because, again, if we get prescriptive, if we simplify things, you just need to snap out of it. Just buck up. Don't be a wuss. Right? I mean, we have to be careful. Those are prescriptive because we've tried to simplify things down too much. Or, let's be careful, you're being selfish.
This is the Men Refined podcast.
Hey friends, welcome to the Men Refined podcast. I'm your host, Rafael Sifontes. In this episode, we'll have a conversation about feelings and also our mind, how our mind really challenges this relationship that we have with our God and how our minds sometimes engages in that battle of the will in our own lives. This obviously can affect the way we see God in our lives and our relationship with others. And why community can also play an important role in our lives and our relationship towards our Creator. I invited today my good friend Rodney Ruble, to the podcast. He was a missionary once in Asia, also a very involved man in the local church. Rod, tell us a little bit about your story. How do you end up in Asia, and a little bit more on how we're going to tackle this theme today?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the church, came to know the Lord at a young age. And when I was in high school, I got the opportunity to travel to Asia with some friends and with some family members. And really felt like it was at that time that the Lord really captured my heart to cross-cultural ministry. And so I spent several years in Asia with my wife, Jennifer. And we ministered there for several years, came back to the U.S. and have been involved in local ministry in different capacities in the church. And the topic for today that you wanted us to talk about was mental health, or is mental health, and particularly for men. And part of my experience is the reason that we came back to the United States from China was because my daughter was born with very severe birth defects. And she passed away. That was a precipitating event for me, that I had probably struggled with mood, even as a teenager and young adult. But that was kind of a precipitating event that caused me to experience depression to a degree that it really interfered with some different aspects of life. And so at that point, I was clinically diagnosed as suffering from chronic depression. And that's something that I've experienced and dealt with all of my adult life, and have been involved in various different things as far as ways to address that. I've been under a doctor's care, been involved in, talk therapy, counseling, have used medication as well, and as well as other spiritual exercises to help, be able to process that and function as an adult. Most people, when they interact with me, probably wouldn't guess that's the first thing, when they interact with me. But it is something that I've experienced pretty much my entire adult life. So this topic of mental health in men is something that's it's part of my lived experience. So looking forward to our conversation about it.
How many kids do you have now?
We have 4 kids that are with us, and then my daughter is in heaven.
When were you diagnosed with depression? At what age?
That was in my 20s when I was diagnosed. We already had 2 children.
Okay.
And so my daughter was my third.
Okay.
And it was after all the situation we went through with her that I was fortunate. I was in a Bible study with my personal physician.
Oh.
And he was talking to me about stuff. And he's like, I think you might need to talk with somebody. So it was really good. It was actually really helpful to have that connection. So that's what led me down that path.
How can you, if you see somebody, a man in this case, if you see a man, can you tell if that guy is depressed or not? Is that something that you can visually label as a depressed man?
I think we want to be very careful labeling anybody, anything.
Absolutely.
Now, typically when someone's talking about clinical depression, there are typically some things that they look for, loss of interest in different things, motivation, even ability to be coherent in thoughts, sluggishness, energy level. I mean, there's all these different things that are clinical signs of depression.
But I don't see that in you.
Well,
right?
Well, yeah, because I think that there are times where you probably do see that in me.
Okay.
And do see those things with me.
Now I have to pay more attention to you.
That's right. That's right. So
I have to be now self-aware of you, the way you interact with others and the way you behave. Because that's something that, again, I don't think we think much about it as we interact with other men.
That's right. And part of that is...
Should we?
Should we? Absolutely, I think we should. Because, this topic, mental health, okay, it is such a massive topic, right? And such a big thing to think about. Because when we talk about mental, we're talking about the mind, right? We're talking about what's going on in your head. And you're maybe better at it than I am, but many times I don't even understand what's going on in my own head. I don't understand my own mind, right? And so we are talking about the most complicated, when we start talking about mental health, we are talking about the most complicated thing in the cosmos. I mean, think about it.
100%.
Yes.
So nobody wants to be inside my mind.
I was about to say, what goes on between your head puts other things like quantum mechanics to shame.
Oh, boy.
So we have to approach this whole thing with some humility and some we don't understand or we don't know completely. And so it's important that we are careful because when you approach something you don't understand, there are several different ways you respond to it.
Oh, 100%.
One is to minimize it.
Yeah.
And if you minimize something along these lines, because you can deal with it or you can process it if you minimize it, there's the potential of not really understanding, somebody you're interacting with. And, comments you make or whatever may not be helpful, may in fact be hurtful if you're not careful. So you got to be careful not to minimize what's going on between somebody else's. The other thing is like what you were just describing is you can either avoid it or not think about it.
In my own story, within the last year, I have been trying to understand a little bit more about the mental health issue that is going around us. I'm not sure if this is due to the fact that I am maturing at my 46 years old. Can you imagine now is it that I'm starting to mature? Or I'm actually trying to understand better. The more I work within men's ministry, which is this portion of church life, really, dedicated to the well-being and connection of men within the church. I think there's a lot of that we need to be aware in order to try to grow these relationships with other men. Because in the past, I've not been very good at it due to the fact that I've been ignorant in the matter about mental health. And because I have been ignorant, not by choosing to be ignorant, I will say, but mostly because I have not lived that or, have a relationship with somebody who has mental health issues, going through depression or anxiety or whatever you want to call that, mental problems, etc. So, see, when you're not part of something, it's very hard for you to relate to that, right?
Sure.
My dad passed away. He's in heaven out of lung cancer. We lived that through many years, and it was tough in the family. It was tough on us, but we learned a lot. Now, the way I see people that are going through dealing with cancer, man, I have a totally different grace for them.
Right.
I can relate so closely. So mental health has been in my radar for quite some time already. And now is that I'm actually trying to invest a lot of my time to understand a little bit more so I can have more grace and I can be gracious in it. And I think the part that I'm trying to understand really most of this mental health issue is how do you deal with people that may or may not have mental issues, but at the same time, how do you not make jokes on the mental health issues? Because I could tend to make jokes about it. When people mention the word depression,
Sure.
for me, I see depression as a feeling, and I want you to correct me if I am wrong. It is also a chemical imbalance. It could be triggered by chemical imbalances, etc., etc. But I'm trying to see, I usually see things black and white, and I'm trying to learn to dwell a little bit on the gray, okay? So bear with me on that as I'm learning, as I'm growing up on that aspect on my life to understand where those gray areas need to be more pronounced in my life or not. Because I usually dwell in black and white or ones and zeros. So I don't know what that. Why is that? It could be the technical guy on me, or it could be that I'm just probably hiding something, right? That usually men don't want to handle their drama, so they just grab that drama and they just put it in that side of their brain that they don't want to deal with it until they have to, right? Because dealing with the drama is challenging. It's going to create friction in the relationship, and it's going to bring all that to life,
right?
Which you still have to deal with that, right? I mean, dealing with it is the natural, healthy way to bring about restoration in that relationship. So no matter what, you have to deal with it. But we as men, the majority of men, per se, they just don't want to deal with the drama. They just don't. They just compartmentalize some certain things, and they're just like, okay, yeah, we had a bad argument yesterday. Okay, no, don't worry about it. I'll pass by. I'm not thinking about it, so don't worry about it. I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, right. And so the question would be, is that healthy?
Right. We know it's not healthy.
Okay.
We know it's not healthy.
Let's talk about this in a couple of different ways. So you mentioned the situation with your father, and you've shared some of that before. That experience, what you learned from it, what it taught you. What's hard is sometimes to see the equivalent between something that is so physically manifest that you can put your fingers on, that you can see in a scan, that you can see, to see that as an equivalent in emotion. So I could make an argument, and you could talk with people who are not believers, who are materialists, who would say there seems to be a system in your body that moderates or deals with emotions. And there's kind of an evolutionary advantage to emotions, right? So something that's positive that you should approach, there's this positive bing, right? That's good, says do that. Something that's negative, there's a shock, stay away from it. And that system is built into our body. And our feelings and our emotions are built to be functional like that, to tell us, no, this is a good thing, pursue it. This is a bad thing, avoid it. Right? And so emotions serve some sort of purpose, and there's this system that's built in. I approach the things that are good, I avoid the things that are bad. So we have this emotional system. You think about your father's situation with cancer, your perspective toward that was very different because it was something you could see, something you could see the scans of, you could hear professionals talking about. It's very different when you're talking about this system over here that you can't scan for. I would argue it could be just as broken a system as what's happening, what happened in your father's body. And so, you would never crack a joke about your dad's cancer.
No.
Or you would never let somebody do that. But on the flip side, we would make a joke about somebody whose maybe their emotional system is broken and unhealthy. And so I think that...
And we'll make jokes about it.
And we'll make jokes about it.
All
and
the
so
time.
my caution with that would be that even though it's something that we can't see as physically as a broken bone or, a cancer cell or whatever, emotional brokenness, the emotional system that's built to help us navigate the world, it shouldn't surprise us that that could also be broken. Right. Or that could also be in some way unhealthy. You were talking about just how does this all fit within a Christian worldview? Well, sin is a big deal. It breaks everything.
Oh, it breaks everything.
So it breaks us sexually, it breaks us psychologically, it breaks us emotionally, it breaks us spiritually, it breaks us physically. So it's very easy to look at the cancer in your dad and say, boy, you can see that this is a result of the fall.
Yeah.
We were never intended to be that way.
Yeah.
In the same way, when you see someone suffering from depression, you can say, oh man, this is a sign of us living in a fallen world. And we should be compassionate about that. That one of the ways to think about it is, the whole fight or flight. So you've heard fight or flight, where you're exposed to something that's threatening. Your response, your adrenaline kicks up, your cortisol level, whatever, and you either want to fight that or you want to run away from it. Well, there's also a kind of a third option, which is freeze. Fight, flight, and freeze.
Yeah.
And, you can think of that in the terms of like the guy that's in World War I. He can't run out of the tunnel or whatever, right? He can't fight. He can't fly.
Can't show his
so
head,
he just
so
freeze.
He
What do you do? You
freeze.
just shut down.
Correct.
You just essentially lock in.
Correct.
And I think even though that's a very beneficial mechanism, typically, for survival.
Yeah, circumstances.
Sometimes you can get stuck in that freeze.
For way too long.
And that's where some people might say that's kind of like what the experience of depression is. Your fight or flight system has been activated, but you're frozen.
That just reminds me of this comic book sometimes when people freeze and the guy right next to it just slaps the heck out of their face and the guy just comes back alive, right? How does that work with depression? How can you define depression? And then we expand there.
So are you talking how they clinically define depression?
No, how do you define depression?
How do I experience or what I've
Well,
experienced?
you can define it based on your experience, right?
Right.
Because everybody could define it totally different based on their experience, or unless they're citing research or an article.
There's a clinical definition of depression that usually involves, low mood or very modulated mood, meaning not too high, not too low, very modulated, typically lower. So you're feeling, some people would describe as blue, which affects your outlook. It affects your processing of your brain, like your ability to process information. Even sometimes it can affect you physically to where you have lethargy, you have difficulty even speaking. Your words may be slowed, affects you, emotionally, being able to connect with people becomes much more difficult. When you look to the future, it's daunting, so you tend to withdraw from people or activities. Those are often signs of depression.
All those things that you mentioned can also be attributed to other issues within our health. Mental too, like people, kids with autism. All that stuff that you described can also be put into the autism spectrum just quite easily if it's not managed. Because when autism starts presenting itself in kids, usually you're right, when it gets developed. I have a nephew who's autism. We've seen some of that stuff, in the early days. He's a brain, I will say. This kid is a brain. He's so smart. He draws. It's unbelievable the amount of details that he puts into drawing. He's an amazing kid. But when he's lost or is loose, there's a spectrum of autism. Everything that you mentioned can be put into that category also.
Well, and that's where
it's very challenging.
It's very challenging because that's where, a professional, someone who can clinically, and like we were talking about earlier, we're dealing with something so complex.
Yeah.
Professionals try to put parameters around certain things so that they can say, oh, it seems like we're dealing with this. I mean, that's what a diagnostic approach is. We try to lay down parameters until we can get enough triangulation to say, we think this is X, Y, or Z.
And many
Do I think that there are similar?
Take a long time.
It can take a long time. And again, since we're dealing with something that's more complex than anything you can imagine, we should expect there's going to be a high degree of error.
Yeah.
Meaning that somebody could diagnose, one person with depression, another person with bipolar disorder, another person with autism or whatever, and it's not going to be 100% accurate. And so that's why I want to say, I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing from my experience. Yeah. And as we've talked about it, I can tell my story, but I can't,
Yeah, there's a lot of stats in there about mental health. I mean, the Men's Health Forum says 73% of adults, 73% of adults who go missing are men, and 87% of those sleeping rough are men. They looked also at the prison system. They say that 95% of the prison population, which is 72% of those male that are in prison, mm-hmm. are suffering from 2 or more mental disorders. Mm-hmm. That is huge. Mm-hmm. But there's also, from the Mental Health Forum, they can't really tell specifically the percentage of men who suffer from mental health, mental illness, depression, anxiety, because men don't tend to look for help, mm-hmm. right?
Right.
So a lot of people are suffering from depression, anxiety, extreme levels,
right?
And they don't look for help. 75% of deaths by suicide are men. Mm-hmm. 75% of those people who died in the last 3-4 years have been due to suicide.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that doesn't include what they would call, grouped in that is also like deaths of despair. So drug overdoses, mm-hmm. Alcohol-related deaths, all those would fall into that category as well. So it's a
death by despair, but that's you're still self-inflicting your own death, right? Mm-hmm. You're still trying to kill yourself using other mechanisms, mm-hmm. instead of a gun, mm-hmm. or instead of throwing yourself out of a 10th floor or whatever.
Right.
So this is challenging for me, because when I hear about a man killing himself, mm-hmm. okay, and I'm going to treat very lightly here, the first thing that comes to my mind is that guy was selfish, because he left behind his wife, mm-hmm. his kids, because he wanted it to end his own problems. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to be very black and white in here, okay?
Right, sure.
So, yes, you have a problem that you're dealing with. Now, wait, let's go back. You have a problem. One, are you dealing with it, or you just want to make the problem disappear? And there's only one way to make the problem disappear. You got to remove what the problem is attached to begin with. So you kill yourself. Boom, the problem goes. In your mind, the problem goes. But now you're being selfish, because now you're giving more problems to your wife and your kids.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when I see something like that and I hear about it, man, my heart breaks, one. And then I start thinking about it, and I start using my mind, trying to obviously understand something that I cannot mm-hmm. understand, because I've never been through it. Mm-hmm. For me, that's always been, okay, you feel bad, well, feel good. Think of it like, okay, I'm sitting and my back hurts. Okay, sit correctly, mm-hmm. shoulders back. So it's always a way to fix it. For me, that's just how I grew up. Okay, now I'm trying to be very gracious and learn mm-hmm. from this. The more and more I do, obviously, I just ask God to give me grace, because I want to understand where people are, and I don't want to make funny comments on it.
Okay, so let's roll it back and say that when we talk about mental health, we are talking about something that is so multifaceted, so complex, so beyond our understanding. I mean, that's one of the things that means that we're created in the image of God.
Yeah.
So Amen. We're talking the pinnacle of creation here. Just imagine you come up against something that you don't know about, or something you don't understand. Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly powerful. You don't understand it. There are different ways that you can try to approach that or try to understand it. Like we talked about before, you can avoid it. I'm just not even going to think about that.
Yeah.
Or you can try to ignore it, or you try to minimize it. Like it's not really that big of a deal, or it's not as complex as it really seems. Let's try to make it simple. And then if you can minimize it, then you can control it.
Right.
Okay. So I know what to do. So once we start minimizing things, we start to become much more prescriptive. Meaning you need to, if I can minimize your back problem to being just, oh, it's posture, then of course I can be very prescriptive. Oh, sit up.
Right.
But if we're talking about the complexity of the human brain,
Yeah.
and we're talking about these systems that are so godlike. I mean, God's created us with emotions and with thoughts and with brain. When we're talking about something that complex, we have to approach it with humility. We have to approach it with, this is something that's beyond, and I need to be I can't try to minimize it and make it prescriptive. Like, hey, man, just suck it up.
They're too perfect. Now they're broken. Could you imagine? Because when something is so perfect and it gets broken, it is almost impossible to be put back the same way it was. It was just way too perfect. Kind of like when a porcelain pot breaks.
Right.
You're trying to pick up the biggest pieces so you can crazy glue it, and you're putting it together.
Right.
But it's never going to be the same way that it was. You still have little things of porcelain that just went out that you can't even see. There's still little holes in that porcelain pot that you cannot glue back together.
That's right.
To be back to perfect. Talking about the perfection, how God created us as perfect human beings.
So when you're dealing with another mind, it's never a 0 and 1. So we need to approach it from that perspective. And so we need to have empathy. We need to have compassion because I don't understand exactly how brokenness is expressed in your life like it's expressed in my life. And I can understand. I mean, I have great sympathy for men who feel themselves in that level of despair to where they're
for sure
doing things that take their own lives. And I think we have to approach it from that perspective because, again, if we get prescriptive, if we simplify things, you just need to snap out of it. Just buck up. Don't be a wuss. Right? I mean, we have to be careful. Those are prescriptive because we've tried to simplify things down too much. Or, let's be careful, you're being selfish. When we start pointing at things that we don't understand and simplifying them, then we make moral judgments on that. Because it's very easy to go from that's good or bad to that's right or wrong to that's sinful or not sinful or moral. And so for me to immediately, when I hear of someone who has committed suicide, for me to immediately jump in my mind to making some sort of moral assessment of that person, I would say we need to be very, very careful of that.
Yeah.
Because nobody would step in the door to your father's hospital bed and go, geez, look at you.
Yeah.
It's a moral thing, right? No. Why is it that it's like, in that case, we look at you in the hospital bed and we have empathy. We look at you over here where you are at the end of your rope and despairing and you're considering doing this horrible thing to yourself. And we're like, no sympathy or empathy there. So I'm just saying, I think we have to be very careful and recognize that when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about something that is so massive and complex. We have to be super careful and we have to be humble and we have to be approaching it with compassion because it's easy to look at a body broken by cancer, but it's hard to look at an emotional system that's broken by whatever. It could be an adverse childhood experience. That's there's a huge body of literature around what they call ACE, the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences. So if you can show that somebody experienced something on this list, like 15 or 20 items, the likelihood that they end up in prison or taking their own lives or addicted to drugs is massive. So something happened from the trauma of that childhood experience that broke what should be this great system, right, of emotions that helps us navigate the world and stuff. Somehow that system gets broken and that affects their whole course of life. And so, I mean, I think you would have much more compassion if you could see in an X-ray or something, this person was abused when they were a child. So it makes sense that their emotions don't operate correctly, or their memory doesn't work correctly, or their, you know what I mean? I think we have a lot more empathy and compassion when we take the big view of what we're dealing with here.
During COVID, a couple of years ago, we heard of many young guys taking their own life, and people too, etc. We had a few in our church. What goes through your mind when you hear that, especially from our church body, from our fellow believers, knowing that these are families that are part of our community? What goes through your mind when you hear that? How do you process that?
Well, first of all, it's an incredible tragedy, and we have to view it that way. This is not the way God intended. This is not life as God designed it and what he desires for us. I mean, he desires flourishing. And so when you come across something like that, the first response has to be, this is tragedy. This is not the way God designed it. And then our appropriate emotional response should be one of incredible empathy and wanting to sympathize with the family and wanting to connect emotionally. That's the correct emotional response. If you take a step back and you start looking at, like you were just citing all the statistics and all the different things that are happening with men, it's almost like you have to address the elephant in the room. I mean, at some point, you've got to know that those statistics apply to men in the church the same as they apply to men outside the church. Meaning, there are a lot of men that are part of your Bible study, your church, your whatever, that are struggling with mental health. And you got to the word is destigmatize or whatever. It's like, no, we got to be able to talk about this. We got to be able to address it. We've got to be able to say, this is what's going on in my life on every level. Because here's the thing, you may be sitting over there looking at the person who's struggling emotionally and saying, man, I don't know how to reach that guy. Well, at the same time, I'm over here totally struggling sexually. I'm eaten up with addiction to porn or whatever. It's like, you both got to be able to come to a point where there's connection and where there's deep, fellowship, so that you can love and encourage each other. And I would say that, that's the one caution about the whole thing with depression that I experienced and was part of my story is typically when you're in that space, what you do is you tend to isolate yourself.
Right.
I have found what's helpful is exactly the opposite. You need to engage in meaningful relationships more and more, especially when you sense yourself getting into that dark space. Can tell your mood is out of line with what's going on in your life and what's happening. So, I feel like this concept of mental health is something that men have to be willing to address humbly and with, approaching it correctly. Not trying to minimize it, not trying to avoid it, not trying to ignore it, not trying to, all these different things, but be able to genuinely approach each other and say, help me understand, help me understand where you are, what's going on. Because I think that that's part of, at least in my experience, what the Lord has used. I mean, you talked earlier about how we're physical beings created in the image of God, right? So we have a physical component, we have a spiritual component, we're built for relationship, we have relational components. And I would say whenever we're thinking about what helps, quote unquote, I'm doing the air quotes here, with people that are suffering from emotional issues like depression, is those same areas. There's a physical component to it. Yeah, it may mean medication. It can help. It can absolutely help. There's a spiritual component to it. I totally believe that God can work in our bodies. It says in Romans, through the power of his Spirit. So there's a spiritual component, a spiritual connection with the Lord, a spiritual connection with other believers, that relational piece too. Having other people around you that you're involved in loving relationships with. Not one piece of that is the answer. It's actually all of it together. At least in my experience, what's helped me is it's a combination of all those things. I have to do things physically with my body to try to help with managing depression. That may mean taking medication. It may mean exercise regimens. It may mean diet. It may mean how I interact with
Being
alcohol. But then also there's the communal piece. Like I have to be in deep, intimate relationships. I have to talk with my wife even when I don't feel like it. I have to express to her where I am emotionally. I have to be willing to engage with men and have conversations just like this, right? But then I also have to engage spiritually. I mean, David said in the Psalms, Lord, why is my heart downcast within me? It's like, I've prayed that prayer. I don't understand my own, so we have to go before the Lord.
Yeah.
And I mean, so there's components to all those things. And what we try to do is we try to minimize, again, get down to, here's the prescriptive, hey, sit up straight, or hey, snap out of it. Hey, you know what I mean? And those prescriptions don't work.
The biblical worldview in mental health emphasizes the importance of understanding the nature of human beings, because we are created in the image of God. But there's also the reality of sin in our lives, all over the world. But we need that redemption that was done through Christ Jesus. We need to understand it. I like in the 4th chapter of the book of Philippians, in verse 6, it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made to God. And the peace of God from our Heavenly Father, which surpasses all understanding, will guard our hearts and our minds through our faith in Christ Jesus." If this is a prescription, this is the Apostle Paul writing a prescription for believers, so we don't dwell in our state of anxiety that could be extremely related to depression. Let's say if this is a prescription, why we as believers don't really take this prescription to heart, to really understand that this is what the doctor is telling you to do, so you don't get in these moods. But then in John 14:27, this is Jesus speaking. I know that because the letters are in red. I'm just joking. I'm reading from the NKJV Bible. I love this text block. It says, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you." Totally different. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. I mean, this is Jesus saying, peace I leave with you. I'm leaving, but I'm going to leave this peace. This is verse 27. Verse 25 starts with, "These things I have spoken to you, with you, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name," this is before he leaves. He's talking about how the Holy Spirit is going to come into those believers' heart, "will teach you all the things." And then he goes into, "Peace I leave with you." I'm leaving you peace. The one that I give to you is not the same that the word is giving you. "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." There's specific verses in the Word of God that talks about anxiety. I'm going to say quote unquote depression. I'm going to say quote unquote depression because what sometimes bother me is people use that word depression. They prostitute the word. They use it so lightly.
Yeah.
Like it's for everything. They're not giving the proper meaning to these words. And that's usually when I have conversations with other people in general, I usually say, depending on what their words are using, I usually say, can we define? How do you define that? Because I don't know where you're coming from. A lot of people define certain words based on how they understand it, based on how they have seen it in other people, how they have read about it, how social media is displaying this specific word, which is not intended for. Totally different.
Right.
So that sometimes gets me in trouble because it's like they're just calling everything depression now. Like everything. Like, oh my God, my nail broke. I'm depressed. You're depressed?
Right. No, I agree. I think that, again, that sometimes as if, we can treat things very flippantly. And those of us who maybe have experienced something deeper may not respond very well to that. But to your point, as far as what Jesus is saying in John and what, the passage you read from Philippians, it prompts a question in my mind. I would ask, do you think a depressed person can have peace?
I don't know. I will say yes. Just for context, I was down for like 2-3 weeks with a lower back issue. I was very bad. I couldn't even walk. I was in pain. Mm-hmm. And I was describing my situation with somebody, and I said, man, you were depressed. I'm like, what? Depressed? Because I probably said that I was in my room, whatever. I was crying. I was pissed. I was screaming. I was talking to God. I'm like, crap, I can't do nothing. I can't even put my socks. I can't do things around my house. There's only ladies under this roof. I'm the only macho here. They need a man to do certain things. So that really messed with my mind when I could not do certain things.
Right.
As a man, physical things. And at the same time, I was like, but I was there for like 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I was pissed. Yeah. I cry in my closet. I get back. I'm like a new man, That's just how I treat myself. But then they go, no, you were depressed. I'm like, what? Depressed? That for me was like, whoa, is this what depressed look like? You see, talking about how people use the word. And again, I don't know if that's a true statement. I just don't know. I didn't see it that way. Certainly didn't even cross my mind.
Right.
It was just a 5-10 minute show of my feelings at that moment.
And so the persistence of that mood, like if that were to continue for days or weeks, then that might be where somebody would say you're meeting the clinical definition of depression.
Okay.
And so sometimes you'll hear people use the word chronic, which means continual or ongoing. So there is a time component to it. So I think that that's something that...
Do we know what's the limit?
Well, I'm not a professional, but when we talk about mental health, what we assume is there is a healthy way that our brain should work. Okay?
Yes.
And so somebody might say it's totally healthy for your emotional state to be discouraged or down or depressed or upset and angry. And for you to go all over that map, some people might say that's very healthy.
I think so too.
It was only for a short period of time. It worked as it was supposed to. You processed it. You came to some conclusions. You did what you did. And, some people would say that's the normal, healthy functioning of your emotional, psychological system, right? But what some people would say is unhealthy is if, that was the circumstance, but then your back gets health. Your back's not a problem anymore. You're able to do your work. You're able to engage with your family. You're able to do, and yet your mood state is still the same as when you're. So that might be when somebody goes, that doesn't seem healthy. What I would argue is we have to be very careful when we say healthy, because in North America, when we say healthy, what that means is happy.
Yeah. Totally.
So when we say mental health, we have to be very careful, because it almost comes across that you should be happy all the time.
Right.
And if you're not happy all the time, I'm going to direct you to Philippians 4.
Right.
Because obviously you're carrying things incorrectly.
Yeah.
Or if you're not happy all the time, you need to go read John 14.
Correct.
The thing with John 14 is, in that passage, he says, in this world, you will have trouble.
Yeah.
Period. Yeah. Hard stop.
That's right.
A healthy response to trouble is what some people would say are negative emotions, negative affect, whatever. Hey, something's wrong. That's a healthy response. So the response to trouble may be that you're sad, that you're frustrated, that you're angry, that you're upset. That may be totally healthy.
Yeah.
Okay, so wait a minute.
You're just dealing with your emotions. That's okay to have emotions, though.
So there you go. So when we talk about health, we have to be careful that we're not putting this box around.
Yeah.
This is what it means to be mentally healthy.
Yeah.
I would argue there were times where I felt like I was experiencing very negative emotional states, very negative mood states, where I felt like I wasn't able to do the things that I wanted to do or engage with people in the way that I wanted to, but yet I still had peace because of Jesus.
Okay.
So I think it's possible that even people who are struggling with, let's use the tag since we put it there, mental health.
Yeah.
That does not mean you can't, that there's, again, we got to go back to this whole moral judgment thing.
Well, it's
and
the
we got to
same.
be careful with the whole prescriptive thing too.
Yeah, it's the same. If you're sick, if your body is aching, if you're sick, whatever, you lost a limb, you have cancer, you have something physically really happening to your body, you're still feeling the pain, you're still going through the struggle. I'm going through the valley of the shadow of death. It's momentary. I'm struggling there, but I have peace because I know what's in the other side of the valley of the shadow of death. I'm citing Psalm 23. But it's that state of mind knowing that what's going on, it must be temporary. Because my hope is somewhere else. So I'm not negating the fact or what we're dealing with. We're not dwelling in it because our hope is somewhere else.
That's right.
I guess that's the Christian worldview of mental health.
And the same of physical health, spiritual health.
Correct. Yes.
So
Yes.
our hope has to be eternal in the work of
Christ,
the person of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And we have to be very careful that, again, with the whole prescriptive thing, when we're interacting with each other, when we want to love and encourage each other, we want to connect in a way that recognizes where you're struggling with brokenness in your life and trying to point you to hope in Jesus.
Yeah.
So it may not be mental health. It may be physical health. It may be emotional, whatever you want, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
We're all broken.
Yeah.
So again, I think what it does is it puts us in this posture of humility that when we interact with someone, what we really want to point them to is Jesus and hope in Jesus. And I can't prescribe for you what you need to do per se for that hope to increase or for you to give more of yourself to that hope. We have to be very careful when we're trying to prescribe.
Because sometimes people say, well, you're just minimizing my problem and you're pointing me to, I don't know, have faith on somebody, right? And that sometimes come across that way, that people think that because we're dealing in the spiritual realm, you're not paying attention to their problems, their physical problems, right? And it's like, I get what you're saying. I'm still going through this. It's so challenging.
It is challenging.
It's a touch and go sometimes. And I hope that obviously what I described as the way I see things, also the way I'm trying to learn through this, is not taken out of context, but I'm coming from a place of humbleness, because to learn more about this, to understand where people are. And I know it is challenging even for those who are treating people with depression. You can't put all that stuff in a box. What works for you may not work for me. What works for him may not work for her. Right? The brain is so crazy at times that not even people that do neuroscience or stuff like that, they're still trying to understand it. So it's very hard to say, do this, this, and this, and you'll get better. Your mind will be clear, etc., etc. I don't think it's something that you can put in a box and you just mail it to everybody. So it's different. And I think that's the challenging part as someone who deals with, relationship between other men, trying to understand where everybody is challenging, because the way you treat one person is not going to be the same way that you treat somebody else. So we need to modify the way we treat people, and we have to be very personalized on that. Yeah. And in the past, I have not personalized the way I treat people, unless I'm talking between men and women. Treat women one way. Men, we just throw dirt on them. And usually that's how society works, right? Men's are always got the shorter stick, right?
Right.
At the pool. selection. Yeah, that's probably it.
Well, I think that from this discussion, the things that you're saying that resonate with me is when we are interacting with other people, we're interacting with somebody who's bearing the image of God.
Yeah.
And we should approach, like you said, with humility, trying to ask questions and understand. Got to be very careful because the temptation is to try to minimize,
tell me
try
about
to control, try to do all that stuff. So I think that's.
I have to hold myself hostage sometimes,
right?
Because I can I gotta close my mouth sometimes. And I am in this men's group, which they're older. Everybody's older than me, and sometimes I just gotta be quiet and just listen. Because every time I open my mouth, sometimes I say something stupid. So,
well, and things you can say that are true, because here, when you talked about the what's happening with men and the deaths of despair, the discouragement, the number. I mean, if you ask, I think surveys of men right now on almost any dimension you can pick, it seems like people will use the term crisis. Like there's a crisis among men in the United States of America. What we can communicate to each other as men, as we were just saying, we can approach each other with humility.
That we care for each other.
That we care for each other, that we can point to Christ and say, okay, I don't know what it looks like for you and for me, but together our hope is in Christ. Yeah. And that's where we're moving toward him. The big thing though is recognizing the image of God in each other so that I can say to you something that's very true, which is maybe you're dying of cancer, but I can say to you, Rafael, I see you. You're valuable. You're created in the image of God. Because of what Christ did on the cross, you've been reconciled to God. You are now a son of God. And you're more valuable than anything else in creation. That we can say with truth. And we want to live that way, right? So if somebody's struggling with something physical, something emotional, psychological, mental health, whatever, we can speak that truth, being open and transparent about where we are, the brokenness that we experience in our life.
Yeah.
And what I need to hear from you is, Rod, you're created in the image of God.
Yeah.
You're God's chosen.
Yeah.
Because of Christ, you are his son. Eternal inheritance. This is the hope we're moving toward. I mean, regardless of what we're dealing with, those are the things that we can really point to and encourage each other in.
Rodney, in closing, I think every time we get together, I'm amazed because I can hear what you say, and I usually get a lot out of it. So your wisdom really inspires me, the way you say certain things and your knowledge in certain things. But if you could say something to those who don't know how to handle something like this, right? How to probably treat somebody who may or may not have anxiety issues or depression issues. You may have said something along those lines before, but to be specific, when we try to treat older men with respect and trying to connect people with respect and honor them at the same time, I mean, what would you advise to those men? Two things, right? First, those who are going through some sort of depression, what can they do besides, okay, one, you need to get help, but how can they see themselves, right? And two, what would you say to those guys who don't know how to have these relationships or how to connect with those who we know are dealing with some sort of depression?
Well, I think if you're the first person, who's me, who's struggling with depression or experiences depression in their life, a couple things I would say is, one, ignore the tapes in your head that says that there's something wrong with you, that you're a bad person, that you're whatever. Because depression does not equal some sort of moral issue on your part.
Okay.
Right? You wouldn't say that to yourself if you were diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, that's
so
good.
Why do you treat yourself differently? So that's one thing. Like you said, we are a multifaceted being. And so it's going to be multifaceted ways to navigate this. So that may mean medication. there's nothing wrong with that. Praise the Lord that we live in a day and age where we understand some things about how chemicals affect our bodies and stuff. Maybe medication would be helpful.
Yeah. I'll say if you're in pain, you don't want to be like,
right. You're taking aspirin.
I'm taking painkillers. I'm telling you, pain sucks.
So I think that's one, we want to recognize that our brokenness is not something to be shamed about. We all experience brokenness in different ways. I break my arm, I do things, I treat it, and we adapt, we live with it, we do all. And so that's one thing. There's going to be some physical things. You may need to exercise. You may need to change your diet. I mean, there's a physical, there's a spiritual component to it as well. You need to spend time with the Lord. You need to spend time in the scriptures. You need to spend time. But the biggest thing, not the biggest, but one of the things that you mentioned earlier is just authentic relationships. Because in authentic relationships, I can tell you what I'm struggling with. So when we get together, I can tell you, Rafael, I'm in a very dark place right now. And you're not judging me. You're not prescribing. You're with me in that and saying, hey, I get that. And, so authentic relationships, the struggle is you want to withdraw.
Yeah.
Anytime you feel like you're struggling in mental health, whatever that means, I'm not happy, I'm not satisfied, I'm not whatever, the tendency is to withdraw.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
Engage, push, engage, engage, even though you don't feel like it. So that would be the one, for those of us that are struggling, for loved ones that are interacting with people that you can tell are struggling emotionally, I think it's real critical to have that big view of saying, people would say lack of judgment or something, but I think compassion is a big thing, and empathy and understanding that this is a very complex, multifaceted issue, right? And it's very easy when we see somebody struggling in an area that we don't struggle in to be prescriptive again, right?
Yeah.
Oh, snap out of it. Oh, stop doing that. Don't do this. So I think as loved ones interacting with someone that has shared this with us, or we see that they're struggling in this area, I think, understanding, compassion, approaching with humility. You use that word. I just think humility goes so far that it's like, man, I don't understand what you're going through. I don't understand exactly how your emotions are working or why you're in this place. But I want to understand. Because you're valuable. You're created in the image of God. I need to show you the proper respect and humility and approach you.
Yeah, the care, right?
The care.
You just want to show that you care.
And
you could be doing everything wrong, but you know what? I'm trying here.
Well, and let's
say let's bear with each other here.
A huge thing is avoid the prescription. Because what happens is, there's kind of feedback loops. So this is one of the things with adult children. Somebody told me one time, when you give advice to an adult child, they perceive that as a criticism. So in the same way,
I didn't know
sometimes you got to be careful.
I have one adult child. No wonder.
That's a different topic for a different. All I'm saying is what you may come across as what you think would be an encouragement. Hey, snap out of it. Or, hey, just memorize this passage. Hey, just pray more. Those prescriptive things can be perceived very negatively.
I see.
And may actually make the emotional state even more difficult or troubling, because that's our tendency.
Thank you again for being in the podcast, Rod. Appreciate you. If you're listening to this podcast, if anything at all, you can get any value out of this episode, I'll encourage you to share it with somebody. It will mean the world to us. Thanks again. See you next time. Hey friends, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. And if this content is helpful to you, would you consider rating this episode and subscribe to the podcast? This episode was sponsored by Cyricom Tech, your virtual IT department. Cyricom Tech provides cybersecurity services, cloud services, IT support, infrastructure build, phone systems integrations, and much more. With more than 25 years of experience in the enterprise, Cyricom Tech is here to serve you. You can book a free consultation by calling 720-819-7388. Also on the web at cyricomtech.com. That is SIRECOM tech.com. Until the next episode, God bless you.